In my short talk today, I will be sharing insight into the best practices that cities have used to operationalize the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Cities do this through a newer process called the Voluntary Local Review, or the VLR. I will start by first detailing the opportunities provided by the VLR process, specifically how local human rights organizers can leverage the inclusive SDG framework to legitimize their grassroots work with support from the UN, thus applying pressure by organizing from below while also being aligned with international standards from above. Then I will discuss strategies of an effective VLR and how cities can move this process forward in being more effective. First, I want to explain where our interest in the VLR came from. I'm based in Pittsburgh, and last year the city publicized their intent to conduct a VLR focusing on local government operations, and the city is currently still in that process as of October 2020. Local organizers see this as a narrowly focused exercise that won't have much effect on policies or public consciousness if not done a certain way. So I'm looking as part of a team of folks at the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance to explore the different approaches that other cities have used in conducting their VLRs. We are investigating best practices so that we can apply these broader lessons to Pittsburgh and relay them to other human rights organizers. Although our experiences are based in Pittsburgh, we want our recommendations to be applicable to other organizers in other cities here in the US or around the world. So from our work so far, we realized that most of the resources showcase best practices for cities in conducting their VLRs, but there are hardly any resources that equip civil society with a foundational understanding of how to best engage with the VLR process, and how to make that process meaningful for them and ultimately use it to their advantage. So recognizing this gap, we are interested in improving the public's engagement with the VLR process. We have learned similar lessons from our work with the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, which is a separate UN assessment that reviews human rights performances of UN member governments. Through the UPR City Stakeholder Report, we have realized that these larger UN frameworks are only as useful as civil society makes them. Similar to our work on the UPR, we want to make sure that human rights organizers and our larger communities are informed about the ways in which international processes can strengthen local work. In addition, we will focus on developing concrete recommendations for ways that local governments can realize changes in local policy, relating to things like housing, education, employment, and criminal justice. Building this type of movement locally also allows us to build alliances not only within our city, but with networks of national and international human rights and environmental justice advocates. In the strategy diagram here, you can see how grassroots organizers can align with global frameworks provided by the UN. Then both local and global efforts can apply pressure to governments, building political will that allows for bottom-up self-advocacy that is also accountable to these larger structural frameworks. You can think of the arrow sort of as a boomerang of pressure and coordination, as the local work reinforces the global work and vice versa in order to make governments accountable. The sandwich model we outline here is important for reinvigorating local democracy and political engagement by community members. Since there's sort of this disillusionment and apathy in our current political system where sometimes it feels like there's little hope for overcoming corporate influence and the hegemony of capitalist consumer systems, this method shows how community members can shape their cities and their futures. So in applying this idea to the VLR, you can see that once communities have the capacity to leverage the VLR, we can use it to apply pressure to governments so that the SDGs can be meaningfully adopted. So that's our hopes with this project, and next we'll get a little bit into the background of the SDGs. They replaced the UN's Millennium Development Goals, and the UN committed to reaching these 17 goals and their 169 targets as their 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs are seen as a, quote, common language for all humankind striving for a better future, unquote, utilizing the people, planet, and prosperity sentiment. Key to reaching these goals by the set 2030 deadline is people-centered action, which would push the required transformations needed at the national and local levels. Part of this effort includes voluntary local reviews. A voluntary local review is a process where local and regional governments voluntarily review their progress in implementing the SDGs. The VLR is a local adaptation of the VNR, the Voluntary National Review, which works similarly, only it evaluates national governments. The relationship between VNR and VLR lets local action convey global results, as linkages between the VLR and VNR can be leveraging points for cities that are all in the same country to call on national governments to respond to their local needs. As cities adopt the SDGs and the VLR, they begin speaking a common language amongst each other. VLRs are a way to foster not only within a country's cooperation, but international cooperation and peer learning, so that cities can share strategies about what is yielding them results. As a peer learning mechanism, the VLR compiles the stories of cities, their policies, and challenges, with the expectation that this process will shape local debates about policy priorities and values. Because of this peer component, effective use of the VLR requires that not only city leadership be involved, but also that residents engage across cities to publicize what their cities are doing and to use civil society peer pressure across cities. This shows elected officials that the world is watching, and it's a way to get politicians to prioritize the values that our movements are advancing. Currently, there are many listening to business actors and centering economic growth and development, and these political processes don't really have very much room for marginalized community voices. So where local political structures exclude residents and give undue influence to corporate and business actors, the VLR counters that and helps give civil society voices more opportunity to amplify their perspective by using international frameworks and opportunities. The SDGs have the potential to mobilize the legitimacy of global norms and put pressure on public officials from below, similar to the sandwich model that was on the last slide. One helpful resource for us has been the VLR Lab, created by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. The VLR Lab has served as a hub of resources which we've been using to understand how cities have approached the VLR process. In particular, a report titled State of the VLR compiles existing VLRs as of February 2020 and aggregates trends in how they're conducted. The report highlights how VLRs vary in terms of their scope, purpose, depth, and duration. The report stressed two main qualities that include a successful and transformative use of the VLR. They're listed here. The first one is an extensive engagement process, which integrates a wide range of stakeholders. The other is to vertically integrate the VLR between different levels of government and to align the VLR with the VNR. Whether or not VLRs become something truly transformative in UN politics, as well as in the real lives of local communities, depends on how advocacy movements use the process to shape policy discourse and public conversations about community priorities and values. Building and supporting an active community engagement process that assesses local SDG compliance, while identifying and advocating for local implementation of these best practices, is crucial to the VLR success. The following slides will identify some key practices of conducting VLRs, which allow them to be used to reinforce and strengthen the political dynamic that we have outlined. We seek to pull out lessons for how we can use this approach, and as we map out a plan for engaging with the VLR here in Pittsburgh. These lessons are from the IGES report on the Shimokawa method, as Shimokawa's VLR process is considered a successful model for other cities to follow in order for their VLR findings to be meaningful. Here's a little bit of context about Shimokawa. It's a small town in Japan with 3,400 residents and a pretty small municipal budget. Some of the predominant issues facing Shimokawa relate to depopulation, aging, and the sustainability of their energy with regards to the forestry industry. After completing their VLR, solutions attempted to address these issues in an interconnected way, and they ended up using local woody biomass to produce renewable energy, and then that energy was put towards public utilities and housing. In the switch to renewable, the money saved was put forward to paid childcare. So this is really just I'm just including this as an example to show how their final solution really tried to address a lot of the issues that they were facing, and in that way they were able to pull people from different issues that they might not have known about, and really took an inclusive approach to defining the problem, so then they were able to solve the problem in a really inclusive way. So this report, the Shimokawa method, provides a detailed step-by-step method to conducting VLRs. The graphic here summarizes the 10 steps that they've used, but I'm going to go into a few of the steps that I want to highlight. First, I'll talk about their engagement process and their wide range of stakeholders. Shimokawa expanded their range of stakeholders by organizing local residents around the potential brought by the SDGs. In this comprehensive stakeholder engagement process, Shimokawa created special institutional mechanisms to implement the SDGs. They formed a SDG Future City subcommittee that eventually revised the municipality's comprehensive plan. So they created new processes for engagement and made the entire process more participatory in that way. Because they organized local residents, community had ownership of the process, and then they were well informed about the opportunity that the VLR offered. The SDGs were localized in Shimokawa to the point where they were reframed. Some of them were reframed to more city-specific goals, while still embodying the spirit of the SDGs. This method highlights how VLRs translate the common language of SDGs into local actions. With VLRs, it is hoped that local and regional governments can work with supporting organizations to call on their national government to make necessary policy changes. So in this way, it enables local and regional governments to deliver inclusive, ambitious transformation for their communities. Because the support for this work ranged from the individual level throughout the city government, they established a broad consensus of support for the platform based on creating a more sustainable society. One of the reasons their SDG implementation effort was so successful is its use of backcasting as a strategy. Backcasting is a planning approach that sets a specific future outcome and then forecasts policies and programs in reverse, connecting the specified and desired future with the present state. Because everyone started on the same page and they came up with the future that they want together in a consensus building process, obstacles were easier to work around as their actions started with a shared mindset. It's also important to think about who was included in these backcasting sessions. Shimokawa adopted the SDGs Leave No One Behind objective in order to be more inclusive. So instead of defining local stakeholders in the traditional way of business, civil society, and academia, there were efforts to engage marginalized stakeholders and members of civil society who sometimes face obstacles in joining the stakeholder process. So in people-centered governance like this, it allows us to build a stronger and more vibrant political democracy that can address the profound issues being faced. In engaging civil society across all population demographics, cities are able to creatively address their current state of extreme inequity and fossil fuel dependency. Shimokawa sets a good example as to how to meaningfully incorporate SDGs into urban policy. As the State of VLR's report mentions, some cities use their existing planning framework and rephrase their goals to align with the SDGs, while other cities attempted more of a fresh start. Instead of retrofitting old goals into the SDG framework, they found novel pathways for sustainable development, truly localized the SDGs, and then used this as a roadmap to implementing the change that they would like to see. This is the case for Shimokawa. They came up with this new policy framework so that the VLR was not just a review of progress, but also it was a tool to rethink the solutions being advocated for. So really like starting at the beginning and starting at the root and thinking about how they could meaningfully address these SDGs. Other cities in their VLRs, they did not create such a transformative solution. So there was a little bit of retrofitting existing efforts and adding in the SDG language. And in doing so, they lose the transformative capacity for applying the SDGs. In addition, other approaches don't work on creating a new framework in order to get more engagement for civil society. And there isn't really much of a follow-up process. So if they decide to use existing citizen consultation instead of creating new, the process isn't being made more inclusive. Overall, in this strategy, it's really more so about implementing and monitoring progress and not about bringing new people on board and making the process more participatory. So in these other approaches, we see what we might call SDG washing, where cities align with the SDGs but don't take the transformative actions that we want to see for the SDGs to be meaningful. Compare that to the Shimokawa method that had genuine SDG engagement, and it allowed community members to voice their own opinions and make the SDGs part of the way they understand their city. So we went through these details to highlight the importance of engaging civil society. If civil society is not meaningfully engaged, we worry that the report will not offer effective solutions and instead will operate as more of a slick PR move rather than as a meaningful framework to engage with global issues locally. We're left thinking about how we want to apply these lessons to civil society groups as they engage with upcoming VLR processes. I didn't go into this on the earlier slide, but one of the first steps that Shimokawa took was a awareness raising campaign so that civil society understood the transformative potential for utilizing the SDG framework. Students were brought on board, and then the students organized local resident workshops to give feedback so that they actively co-created their SDG map together. This resulted in a sense of shared ownership in initiatives that transformed stakeholders into active participants. Knowing this, we are thinking about how Pittsburgh can adopt genuine participatory processes so that broader society can engage. Noticing this gap, our hope is to equip organizers with the SDG and VLR know-how. We are also thinking about what the city can do to better support civil society engagement. So if stakeholders can't make it to the table, how do we address that and eliminate obstacles that prevent engagement? The idea as of now is to compile lessons and general information so that civil society can be informed on what the VLR process entails and how they can engage. As VLRs become more common, the next generation of VLRs should have meaningful engagement mechanisms that are accessible to broader society, especially marginalized perspectives. We know that VLRs have the potential to create meaningful change rather than be SDG washed, and that is what we would like to see. As we set out to put together information regarding the VLR, I've included a link to our work on making the UPR more accessible. Following a concise toolkit approach similar to the one we used for the UPR would allow us to convey the most significant aspects of the VLR to human rights organizers that are already highly involved in grassroots work. Thank you again for tuning into my presentation today. Please leave any comments or questions you have. Thank you so much to the University of California, Santa Barbara. Thanks again. Goodbye.